The Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, has been hit by a missile attack, with critical infrastructure apparently the target. Journalists reported a series of explosions overnight, saying that warning systems had failed to sound the alarm. The mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, urged people to take shelter and said that missile debris had fallen in the west of the city. Our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse has more from Kyiv.
There were a series of reported explosions from around 4 a.m. this morning. Concerningly, the sirens didn't sound for a couple of hours, but what we are being told is that missiles have struck in the eastern flank of the city, and the authorities are saying that infrastructure has been hit. We don't know where, and we don't know what. Now, Kyiv and so many cities around Ukraine are used to threats from the sky. At the moment, we don't know where this current threat is coming from. It can sometimes be missile strikes from the Caspian Sea. It can be through Russian fighter jets in airspace in Belarus, where they have stationed troops and aircraft. We just don't know at this stage. But even if, the city's air defence systems are fairly effective, but not completely effective, so missiles can get through. And even if missiles are intercepted, the falling debris poses a real threat as well. So we, like the rest of the city, will stay down here and wait to hear more.
Well, the strikes come as the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said Britain would send tanks to Ukraine along with additional artillery support during a phone call with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. For more on that, here's our political correspondent, David Wallace-Lockhart.
The two leaders have spoken this morning, and we've got a readout from Downing Street with a spokesperson saying that they spoke about the successive Ukrainian victories they'd been and agreed that now was the time to seize the moment with an acceleration of global military and diplomatic support to Ukraine. Part of that from Downing Street will be sending Challenger 2 tanks and additional artillery systems. My understanding is we're talking about around a dozen tanks being sent to Ukraine. But if we think back to when this conflict was beginning, there was a big stress on the UK would help with defensive weaponry. Now, I think Number 10 would still say in the context this ultimately will be used, it is still defensive weaponry. But we can certainly see the support in terms of weapons that the UK has been giving Ukraine certainly stepped up throughout this conflict.
And will this latest tranche of weaponry make any significant or material difference to the direction of the war actually on the ground?
I think in isolation, the honest answer to that would have to be probably no. These are 12 tanks we think we're talking about. Ukraine are talking about the need for 300 tanks. But where this could be significant is the UK is now the first NATO country to pledge that it will give tanks to Ukraine. European countries like Poland would like to, but there's a slight complexity around their German-made tanks, and Germany has to sign off on that. There's going to be a meeting of European defence ministers this coming week where there could be important implications there. The US, of course, another country that people will be looking at with interest to see what they do next. I think the significance of this will all be about the message this sends from the UK, and perhaps other countries then having to consider whether or not they're willing to make a similar contribution, which of course could then perhaps start to change things, or at least start to creep towards that 300 number that Ukraine says they need.
Just to pick up on something you said earlier, the UK will be probably framing this in terms of it being provided as defensive equipment. If Russia doesn't see it that way, and Russia sees it as equipment that is part of an offensive, it almost doesn't matter what the UK portrays it as. If it comes to it and Russia sees a NATO country arming Ukraine in that way, what response could there be to that?
Well, it's part of the complexities of this whole conflict, and from a Russian perspective, it can see Western nations consistently trying to aid Ukraine with military help in order to fight a conflict against Russia, something that obviously the Russian state, the Russian leadership is not going to be particularly happy about. And I think when we look at what comes out of countries like Germany that perhaps are quite sensitive around this area, we can certainly see that being a consideration. And obviously action the UK has taken directly against Russia in terms of things like sanctions. Certainly the UK is not pulling its punches on who would like to see win this conflict, but certainly with this development, I think you'd have to watch with interest about how Russia will perceive it.
It's David Wallace-Lockhart there.